Thank you. Yeah, I need it now. Yeah. Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for coming. You all have these fancy microphones. You can hear me now? Is there any way we can make it so we can see? Does it come a little bit lower? It does. Does the screen come just a small bit lower? Just so you can see the screen, the PowerPoint. Or can you guys see it? Just barely? I don't... Anyway, so much. Let's say here. All righty. So again, thank you so much for coming. I wrote this book, Partners to History. It's about my dad and Martin Luther King and the Civil Rights Movement. And I wrote the book because my dad was the love of my life. He was this absolutely wonderful man who felt a moral obligation to try and make the world a better place. And my father's grandfather, Grandpa George, I think that's better. He was 12 years old when Abraham Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation. And he told my dad about something called Reconstruction. And my father's father used to say to him, the bottom rail will come to the top. So based upon that, my dad was, you know, geared up to get active, to get involved. And for him, I guess he started when they were in Alabama, and it was a segregated school that he went to. And he was very good with math and science. And he said, well, I think that we should be able to have a really good science department because schools were segregated at that point. And so his first protest was to have better equipment. Subsequently, they got better equipment. And then he got to college, to Alabama State. And while he was there at Alabama State as president of the student body, he became active, which is I hope that you guys do. And by being active there with the student body, the president of the college saw this, took him under his wing, and while he was still a student, he then started teaching at Alabama State. And that was a wonderful thing for him, and he found this wonderful man named, my mind just left me for just a second. But he befriended this wonderful guy, Pastor Vernon Johns, and he was this great scholar, and he was the pastor of Dexter Avenue Baptist Church. So Dexter Avenue was the kind of church where if you were fair-skinned, because this is what black people did, if you were fair-skinned and your hair could go through the fine tooth of a comb, then you would be a member of Dexter Avenue Baptist Church. Now, Dexter Avenue was right downtown where the courthouse is in Montgomery, Alabama. And that courthouse was right next door to where the Confederacy had their old White House. And so Dr. Johns was a rebel rouser. So they were not happy that he was a rebel rouser and he'd wear these overalls and things like that. And so they wanted to kick Dr. Johns out of the church. And what he would do sometimes on Sunday morning, he'd say, you know how preachers would get all excited and he'd throw his handkerchief up in the air and he'd say, I resign. And then the deacons would say, oh, Brother Pastor, please don't do that, don't do that, don't do that. Well, on one of these particular mornings, because he was so out of control, when he threw that handkerchief up and said, I resign, they say, we accept your resignation, Pastor. And so Dr. Johns was out. So that's Dexter Avenue Baptist Church without a pastor. So Dr. Johns sat there in the parsonage. Mrs. Johns left in the parsonage. So the church said, oh, Lord, the only way we can get rid of this man is to turn the lights off. So they turned the lights off, turned the water off and everything, and he was just miserable. So then he went up to Virginia. And then he found out that Martin Luther King was coming down to preach his trial sermon. So Dr. Johns said, call my dad on the phone. He said, Ralph, they got this young whippersnapper going to come down here and preach, and I want you. Can I preach at your church on Sunday morning? I'm going to out-preach him. So Daddy said, sure, Dr. Johns, because he loved Dr. Johns. He was his mentor. And at this point, my dad was working over there at the local NAACP, and Rosa Parks was the secretary, and E.D. Nixon was the president of that NAACP, and he was a Pullman porter, which was a good job for black people back then. You know what Pullman porters are? They are the men that meet you when you come on the train, and they say, yes, ma'am, can I take your suitcase? That kind of a thing. And that's what he did. And so let me just back up for one quick second so you all understand before they meet. My dad was at Atlanta University, and he's getting his master's degree in sociology. He had finished Alabama State. Dr. Watkins loved him, had embraced him. So now he's gone to Atlanta to get his master's degree. And being a preacher, preachers go to churches. So my dad said at the close of his, he said, I want to go over to Ebenezer to hear this young preacher, Martin Luther King Jr. Reverend King Sr. had invited him. And Martin preached so prolifically. So at the end of the service, my dad went to the back of the church where pastors congregate, shook hands, they liked each other, and then they went their separate ways. My dad had a date with this young woman, and I found this in my book. I'd totally forgotten. My dad had a date with this young woman who was a student over at Spelman College in the Atlanta University system. There's Morehouse, which was an all-male school. There's Spelman, which is a female school. Daddy was at Atlanta University. So he called the young lady to check with her on that Sunday afternoon to let her know, I'm going to be picking you up. And she's like, oh, Ralph, I can't go. I have a cold. I'm so sorry I can't go on the date. And my dad said, that's okay. That's all right. I'll take a rain check. We'll do this another time. So Daddy never canceled his plans. When he was on a mission, he was on a mission. So he decided he was going to go on ahead to the Sisters Chapel at Spelman College to have this concert. And underneath there at the tree, he saw Martin Luther King, this pastor, that he was so impressed with, this young man. He walked over to Martin and he's like, hey, Martin, how you doing? And there was the woman that had stood him up for that date, for the date with Martin Luther King. So they laughed, and they thought to themselves, oh, whatever. And they said, okay, they went to the concert together. And a friendship was born between these two young men in the university system. And they got rid of the young lady, and then they went their separate ways. So now let me jump ahead now to where I was with Dr. Johns. Now, Dr. Johns has been kicked out of the church, and Martin is coming in to preach the trial sermon. So Dr. Johns hitches this ride with my dad, or hitches the ride with Dr. Johns. And Dr. John said, oh, take me over to this house. It was 1327 South Hall Street, where my parents lived. And he was so late, my dad was worried. He said, when he got out of the car, he saw this teeny-weeny little figure coming up the walk. He said he looked familiar, but he wasn't quite sure who that person was. And when he got to the door, he saw Martin's face, and he was so happy because this had been his friend, and now they were being reacquainted. So they came into the house, they sat down, and they broke bread. And, Martin didn't want to eat at first because he was like, well, I'm sure the people over at Dexter Avenue have food for me this evening. And Dr. John said, well, I'm telling you, they don't have the kind of soul food that you need to be having that Juanita Abernathy is going to cook for you. So that's when they finally convinced him to eat. But that night, Uncle Martin got a chance to hear what Dr. Johns and Daddy had been talking about, which was the crises of the Negro in Montgomery, Alabama. Because Montgomery was a rough town and a violent town. And Rosa Parks would be the third woman to be arrested. Not the first, but the third woman to be arrested. And you guys knew what happened was when black people would come in, you'd put your money in the front of the bus. Then you'd go outside the bus. And then you'd walk around. I won't cross. Then you walk around and then up to the back door. And there was a situation where one woman had been caught. And the bus, her foot had gotten caught in the bus. And the bus, a bus driver had the discrepancy to do whatever he wanted to do. There was a definite dividing line for black and white. And this particular bus driver had already had a run-in with Rosa Parks before. But on this particular day, Rosa, who was 42 years old, a seamstress, and she was the secretary at the local NAACP. So Rosa was tired, and you guys know the story of what happened with Rosa. She was tired, she was legitimately tired, and she was legitimately seated where she was supposed to be seated. But when this white guy got on and they asked her to move, she just said, I'm not going to move. So Edie Nixon called my dad that night, it was the wee hours of the morning, and told him what had happened. And Daddy said, okay, do me a favor, will you call my friend Martin you know. So he got on the phone and he called Martin, and Edie Nixon got on the train and he went north. And he said, Ralph, we've got to organize. We have to do something. Well, Rosa was a very, very, very sweet woman, a really, really kind woman. And for Rosa to be arrested, black people got upset. So my dad at that point was still working over at Alabama State. He was teaching sociology and mathematics at Alabama State University. So he went to Joanne Robinson. And Joanne Robinson was a teacher in the English department, and they had, because the university system was very important in making this happen, they had this women's political conference, and they had been trying to make headroads with the city all of this time, but they were getting nowhere. So they started running off these flyers. So my dad went to the ministers and appealed to the ministers and said to them, please, we have got to organize. Can we do something? They said, okay. And then Joanne had run the flyer, so my dad met her at the school. So they gave the flyers to all the little children. So what one little child did was he took his flyer and he gave it to his mother. And his mother was a maid for a white woman. And she took the flyer and gave it to the lady that she worked for. And she said, excuse me, ma'am, if you don't mind, on December 5th, they've asked us to stay off of the buses, because on December 1st was the day that Rosa was arrested. December 5th, we need to stay off of the buses. And the lady said, oh, my God. So she took the flyer and she gave it to the man of the Montgomery Advertiser. And the man in the Montgomery Advertiser said, oh, my God, do you see what these Negroes are trying to plan? I cannot believe this. So what he did was they ran a full-page ad in the Sunday paper. And in the process of running the full-page ad in the Sunday paper, they alerted everybody to stay off of the buses. And it's just ironic, and that's the part that the beginning of the role that the media would play to work for us and in facilitating and making this thing happen. And when I say us, just know I wasn't there. I wasn't born there. You can look at me and see I'm young. So, but no, I wasn't. I'm just kidding. But no, I wasn't born at that point. So, and also, people were fed up because everybody had heard what had happened to Emmett Till, and you all know what happened to Emmett Till, that young 12-year-old boy who happened to whistle to a woman, and they tied him to a cotton gin and threw him into the Tallahatchie River. So people were fed up. So Daddy said he went in, Uncle Martin was working on his dissertation at the time. He said, Ralph, you can use my church. So what they did was, Daddy said he went and picked Uncle Martin up, and they got so as they got close to City Hall, he said, people were everywhere. He said, something big must be happening. I don't know quite what it was. But when they got up there to the church, it was jammed-packed with people. Jammed-packed with Negroes. And at that first mass meeting, Martin said these words that are so prolific that I love, and they go like this. There comes a time when people get tired of being trampled over by the iron feet of oppression. There comes a time when people get tired of being pushed out of the glittering sunlight of life's July and left standing in the piercing chill of an alpine November. Work and fight until justice rolls down like water and righteousness like a mighty stream. And with that, the black people of Montgomery, Alabama decided that they were going to walk. And initially, it was just going to be, you know, that first day. And the following morning, they went to the courthouse. And when they went to the courthouse, they couldn't even get in. It was just so packed with people. Everybody had come to support Rosa Parks. And that night when they had that mass meeting, everybody decided that they were going to stick to this. And they kept with it. And they kept with it for 381 days. And so for 381 days, black people walked. And when you get a chance to look at my book, I want you to get it. It's really important. You see, all of these people are jammed into this church. There's standing room, I mean barely room for anybody to stand, because we had arrived in the United States of America. And don't forget this. Black people arrived in the United States of America in 1619. The first blacks arrived. We arrived 1 year before the Mayflower sailed into Plymouth Harbor in 1620. And yesterday we spoke and we did a little piece about John Brown. And John Brown was the descendant of someone who was on that first Mayflower ship that arrived in 1620. But my ancestors arrived to Jamestown, the mouth of the James River, to harvest a tobacco crop. And we were never allowed to assimilate into the population like the other indentured servants. And at that point in American history, people came from England, white people came from England, and they were doing a kind of a slavery thing as well. But after they did their time, they were allowed to assimilate. But black people were not allowed to assimilate. We were not allowed to marry. We were separated, and we were treated like chattel, and we got nothing for all that we did. And so people were angry. I guess I have to tell the story based on the book, because can you guys see up there? Somewhat. Okay, I'll just continue. Anyway, by crippling them financially, hundreds of thousands of dollars were taken out of the transportation industry in Alabama. And when you cripple people in their pockets, then they listen. And they presented the demands in such a simple way that they couldn't say no. All they wanted were black drivers on the black routes, and they wanted to have the right to sit wherever they wanted to sit. And so my dad said his idea was, if you give them so many things that they can say no to, they'll say yes to the thing that you want the most. And that you can lure more bees with honey than you can with vinegar. And Bayard Rustin came down from the Fellowship of Reconciliation, an organization that I'm a member of now. And he came down and said, will you all make this a nonviolent movement? And initially, they didn't even know that they were going to make a movement. They didn't know what they were going to do. It was just a day-to-day operation. But then Glenn Smiley came, and Glenn Smiley was this absolutely wonderful white man who taught my daddy and Uncle Martin the principles of nonviolence. And when you look at all the history books, Bayard Rustin, nobody talks about. They talk about Bayard Rustin, David Garrow, and Taylor Branch, and all these guys who've won Pulitzer Prizes, but they don't talk about Glenn Smiley. And I want people to know who Glenn Smiley was. And Glenn Smiley is one of those reasons that I wanted to change this initial cover of my book that my first publisher wanted. Because as a first-time author, they tell you what your cover is going to be. And I said, well, something's wrong with this photograph because everybody in this photograph is black. That's just not going to work. My memory of the civil rights movement was an integrated movement, and it was all of us together. So I changed and got this photograph, and you see the clergymen of all different faiths walking together through Arlington National Cemetery protesting the war in Vietnam. And it's very important, these symbols. If it hadn't been for Glenn Smiley workshopping with Daddy and Uncle Martin, what would have happened? Who would have taught them? I don't know, but nobody gives him credit, and I want the world to know that he came by this way. Go to the next one and let's see, and you'll see my dad really fast. Can you see him? I loved him. I loved him so much. He's the only reason I'm here. I didn't do anything prolific or wonderful in my life. I'm here simply based on the circumstances of my birth. And to whom much is given, much is expected. Let's see the next one. Can you see that one? So this photograph is happening during the Montgomery bus boycott. And in the corner is Uncle Martin. Up above him is Pete Seeger, because music is the universal language, and music was the thing. And you had Pete Seeger, you had Bob Dylan, you had Joan Baez, you had Sammy Davis Jr., you had all of these great people who came and gave a part. This is Karis Horton, who lives in Los Angeles. Her father was a man named Miles Horton, who was a white guy, and he ran the Highlander Folk School, where people would come in and learn nonviolence. And then can you see Rosa there? Can you see her? Yeah? No? That man, you're being honest, you can't see, I understand. I love it when you tell the truth. And next to Rosa is my dad. But that was them actually going and trying to learn nonviolence. And people were so afraid. People were afraid because this was the first time that black people were actually standing up. We had endured 244 years of slavery, and then we had endured 100 years of Jim Crow. And Jim Crow was basically the get back. It was that separate world. Let's see the next one. So at the close of the Montgomery bus boycott, after the 381 days, they decided that they were going to create this organization called the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. So they were going to go to Atlanta to convene for this first meeting. So that was Ralph, Martin, and Coretta. They all got in a car, went to Atlanta. Well, my mother stayed behind with my sister. She wasn't feeling up to it. And on January 10th, 1957, my mother said she was asleep and she just finished watching the Jack Paar show. And Jack Paar was the precursor to Johnny Carson. Remember that? And now it's can you hear me? Oh, you can't hear me. Thank you. Okay. Anyway, it was the precursor to the to Jay Leno's show. Anyway, so my mother said that this voice woke her up. She said she thinks it was the angels. She said, "Get up, Juanita, and go get into the bed." So my sister was in the bedroom. My mother got up and she went into the bedroom. And when she got into the bedroom, she said she was there 15 minutes and the entire front of the house exploded. Where she was all covered in glass and rubble. And they had placed the bomb, the dynamite, right here. Can you see any of that? There was a big gaping hole there. And if it had been placed 1 inch closer to the gas line, my mother, my sister would have died. Anyway, so my mom gets on the phone and she calls my dad. And he's at Reverend King Sr.'s house. And Reverend King Sr., who's Martin Luther King's granddad, he was not a nonviolent man. He just didn't follow that nonviolent stuff. He's like, see what you all have done? You all have gone down there and stirred up all these white people in Montgomery, Alabama. And so when he's giving my dad and Uncle Martin the business, my mother is still down there. Well, she heard another explosion and she jumped. And the policeman who was standing in my mother's living room looked at his watch and he said, that would be the First Baptist Church, which was my dad's church. And my mother was mortified. That night they bombed 5 places. They bombed Bell Street, Mount Olive, First Baptist, my parents' home, and the home of Reverend Robert Gratz, who was the white minister of an all-black church. And you'll see in my book Reverend Robert Gratz. And he's still in Montgomery, Alabama right now, he and his wife, and they're just totally dedicated to trying to make this an integrated world so that we can all live together. So, Uncle Martin wrote in his book, Strength to Love, he said, with Raoul's home and his church bombed, all we could do is get down on our knees and pray. And that's exactly what they did. They prayed. And then the following morning, when they could get on the first plane, they left Atlanta, went back to Montgomery, and they left Uncaretta to conduct the first meeting of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. And we wouldn't really see the greatness of Coretta until after Martin died, because Martin and my dad were chauvinists. And they wanted their wives to look good and stay over there. And, but that's the way that was the time. Unfortunately, that was the time. And children were to be seen and not heard. And so after that, Uncle Martin moved to Atlanta. And we stayed down in Montgomery, Alabama. And Uncle Martin used to call every day, saying, can't you come to Atlanta? Please, can't you come to Atlanta? Come to Atlanta. And I remember that little train ride that we took. We took a little train ride from Montgomery to Atlanta to go to their house for the first time to see where they had moved. And Uncle Martin was so determined he went and found a church for my dad to have. And he moved us. When we finally arrived, the King family was there to greet us. Big Mama and all of it, to unpack us and just take over and take our lives and just conduct our lives. And Martin changed our lives. He was the reason that everything was happening. Let's see the next one. So they're in Atlanta and the civil rights movement is starting to go. And the first thing they did was the Albany movement, which they considered to be an unsuccessful movement. But I think it was pretty successful. But you can see here on this photograph, all the way at the top there, is a black man. Well, there are a couple of black men. One is really fair. That's Wyatt T. Walker. Next to Wyatt T. Walker is Jackie Robinson. And Jackie Robinson was such a tremendous man. He used his celebrity for good in the community. So whenever there was a bombing, Jackie Robinson would show up. If ever there was money that was needed, Jackie Robinson gave. Because black people were so poor. We were maids. We were lucky you could be a teacher. There was like 1 or 2 doctors, but basically we worked, the men had very low menial jobs unless you had education. And education was the dividing line. Education was the most important thing. And back then, black people valued the opportunity. Young man, you've come. You need to come on down in here and sit down front and make yourself known, okay? Because Booker, and I put it in my book, Booker T. Washington said he had no schooling while a slave, though he had the feeling that getting into a schoolhouse and study would be about the same thing as young people, come on in here. Getting into a schoolhouse and study would be about the same thing as getting into paradise. Thank you. Thank you. It's very important. So we take for granted the opportunity to have an education. In my lifetime, when I was a little girl, we couldn't go to the public library. So when I finally got the opportunity to go to public library, I made it my mission to work in every library I possibly can and to read as many books as I possibly can, because we were denied those opportunities that young people of color today take for granted. And I want to tell you all, especially those of you who are young people of color, there was a book, and I want you all to get it. It's called Remembering Slavery. And I know I'm off track for just a second, but it's Remembering Slavery. And the young woman who put together this book, her grandfather was a slave. And he told her that when he was young, he had found a book that the white people had, and it was a book about the alphabet. And he got the alphabet, and he was trying to learn the alphabet so that he could teach himself to read. And the overseer saw him. You know what the overseer was, right? The overseer was the man who was there to control the slaves on the plantation. So the overseer saw him, and what he did was he took the young man out and he whipped him. And he beat him in front of everybody, beat him all on the back. And then what they do is after they beat you, then they would put salt in your wounds. And they put salt in his wounds. And when the overseer he decided that wasn't enough. So what he needed to do to the man after that was he took a poker that was in the fire, a piece of wood, and he pulled it out of the wood, and he stuck it in one eye, and then he stuck it in the other eye, and he said, "See, now you will never be able to read. And for the rest of you, take it as an example." So, consequently, this young woman went on a mission because her grandfather said, "Please, don't ever be ashamed that we were slaves. We built this country. I'm proud. We endured 244 years. But what you need to do for me is get as much education as you possibly can and tell everybody what we went through so that you can have the opportunity to read." And that's why I want everybody to understand the value of education. And I know I went off on a tangent, and that young man who came in here got up and left. That's all right. That's all right. So, well, Jackie Robinson is using his celebrity for good in the community, and this is 1961. This is the Albany movement. And you see how good-looking my dad and Uncle Martin are? Can you see them, sir? They wore tuxedos. They wore beautiful ties. They wore incredible clothes. Uncle Martin decided that my daddy wasn't stylish enough. So when he goes shopping, he said, "Come on, Ralph, we're going shopping." And they wore basically the same clothing and the same suits, the same everything. And you'll be able to see in the book, literally, they used to call them the Civil Rights Twins. Let's see the next one. So, 1962. Okay, so now this photograph here is 1965 because they're not all together. But so, after 1962, things started to, build up, and the momentum was building across the country. And for Daddy and Uncle Martin, the next big thing for them would be in Birmingham, Alabama in 1963. So in 1963, they decided that they were going to have a Good Friday March. And in Birmingham, you couldn't try on clothing into the department store. You could go to the department store, look at that hat, but if you were a black person and tried to put that hat on your head, you had to buy that hat. And if you wanted to have that brassiere, you had to buy it on spec, hoping that it would fit you. Because once it touched your body, you weren't allowed to give it back to the store, because I guess we had cooties or something. I guess it's just fear. Fear. My dad said these words: "We hate each other because we fear each other. We fear each other because we don't know each other. We don't know each other because we won't sit down at the table together." So, anyway, Easter in the black community was a big time of year. You had to get a brand new Easter suit, and you got to get a new Easter dress and the crinolines and the panties. And then we do the Easter speech, because in the black community, everything took place in the church. We didn't have anything else. We couldn't go to the restaurants. They maybe had one black restaurant. And Martin and Coretta would come to my parents' house for one night for dinner, and the following night, my parents would go to their house for dinner. So that's how they socialized. So the church was the center of everything. So they just, Uncle Martin decided, well, you know, in Birmingham, if we can't, you know, work in the department stores, we couldn't have the jobs, you know, we don't need to be buying these clothes at Easter time. If we don't buy these clothes at Easter time, those stores in Birmingham will shut down. So the merchants were afraid that Birmingham was going to turn into a Montgomery. So there was a coalition of ministers that came and appealed to Martin in that hotel room. And they were in the Gadsden Motel. And they came to him and said, please, don't do this. We've got to find another way or find another solution. And Uncle Martin said, well, Ralph, I want to march. And if we march, I'm going to get arrested. And, you know, and my daddy, you know, I'm the co-pastor at Ebenezer, so my dad will be able to do Easter Sunday at Ebenezer. But you won't have anybody at West Hunter. And my dad said, Martin, that's quite all right. I want you to come on and I'm going with you. And he just, oh, thank you, sir. He went away and he brought back more black people. Thank you. Thank you, sir. Come on down front, have a seat. This is what it's all about. It's about our history, why you're here at this university, why you have to make the most of your education. You're not here to take up space. You're here to learn and to develop your brains for your ancestors who didn't have that opportunity. So thank you. All righty. So where did I close off at? 1963. All righty. So we're in 1963. And we couldn't change clothes in the department store. And so they decided they were going to boycott, and Uncle Martin was going to have this, he's going to march on. And all the rest of the ministers, nobody supported him, but Daddy said, Martin, I'll walk with you. I'm with you. I'm with you all the way. And I want to just tell you all, I told Sandy Parks, beautiful Sandy, who brought us here. Anyway, I told her last night how my dad and Uncle Martin had only one argument in life. And this was during the Montgomery bus boycott. And they had a meeting. And Daddy presented a different opinion from Uncle Martin. Well, don't you know, at the end of the meeting, Uncle Martin left, made a beeline out of there, went home and got into bed and rolled up in a tight little ball. And Uncle Retta called and said, what has happened? Something has happened. She said, come on over here. So Daddy went over to the house. And when he walked in the room, Uncle Martin was so upset. He was like, Martin, please, please, what's happened? What's happened? And Uncle Martin said, you disagreed with me in front of everybody, and you embarrassed me, and you hurt me. And Daddy said, I'm so sorry. And Uncle Martin said, please, if you ever want to disagree with me, just do it between the two of us. Don't do it in public. And Daddy said, okay. And he said, and by the way, you were right. We'll do exactly what you want to do. And Uncle Martin was yielding, but he was fragile and he was sensitive. He was so prolific because he was so sensitive. He felt so deeply. And they had this bond, this union between him. And my daddy promised him, I'll be there for you all the way. My dad was the kind of guy who liked to be in the background. There are some people who like to be in the background. And historians try to create this competition. But there wasn't that competition. So Daddy said to Uncle Martin, I'll walk with you. So they walk, they start that march, they leave all the rest of those people. And as we'll have it, Bull Connor had them arrested. Lifted them, and you'll see, by the seat of their pants, and threw them in the paddy wagon. So they're in the paddy wagon, right? And the policeman said, well, where do we take them? And he said, well, take them to the Jefferson County Jail. The Jefferson County Jail is full. And the other jail is full. We'll take him to the fairgrounds. The fairgrounds is full. That's full. I said, oh, my God, we can't take him where? Anyway, Bull Connor said, don't you arrest another goddamn whatever. And he said, okay, so what you need to do is take them over there to the Jefferson County Jail, the main jail, get the other prisoners to couple up, and make sure they're separate. And let's see what happens when these two men are separate. And he thought he would beat Uncle Martin down to a pulp. And what happened was Uncle Martin was left to brood. And while he was left to brood, all he had was toilet paper. And on that piece of toilet paper, he wrote in response to those black ministers and white clergymen who came to him telling him to slow down. He wrote the letter from the Birmingham jail on toilet paper, and he gave it to Wyatt T. Walker, that fair-skinned black man I had pointed out a few minutes ago, who was standing next to Jackie Robinson. And he took it by the pages out of his pocket, out of the Birmingham jail and published it. And my dad says that because Martin was left to brood, he did that wonderful thing, and Martin would go to greatness, and that Bull Connor would just be a small little footnote in history. And Bull Connor was such an evil man. He had turned those water hoses and dogs on those young people. And they had had the Children's Day March. The children had walked out of their classrooms. Children were the people that made Birmingham happen. Children left their classrooms, they left their schools. And Glenn Smiley, this white man who taught Daddy and Uncle Martin and me the principles of nonviolence, Glenn was there that day. And Glenn said, Donzaleigh, we were making that walk up the hill, and they turned those water hoses on those children once they got to that Kelly Ingram Park, which is in the middle. He said, Donzaleigh, then Glenn told me this. He said the power of the water hose was so strong it could peel, you would see it peel the bark off of the tree. And they put it on their children's backs. And some people, the power was so great, they rolled like a tumbleweed on down. And what they did, sometimes the children would taunt them, but they were children. So that evening they got to 16th Street Baptist Church, it's the church where they were having these mass meetings. And Reverend John Cross was the pastor of the church. So Daddy said they were there a little bit earlier, and they saw those people because they ran. They didn't know where to run. So the young people ran back into the church. And my daddy said when they ran into the church, he realized that he was in holy ground. He said, I saw those young people running with blood dripping from their bodies because they had been bitten by dogs and covered with water. He said, I took off my shoes and I said to myself, Abernathy, this is holy ground. And I love, because my daddy says these words, these, you know, they had these incredible mass meetings. He said here, I saw young men and women come running in with their garments torn from them and their bodies bleeding because they had been bitten by the dogs. I saw little children, and there were little children, and you'll be able to see it in my book, these young little children that are being arrested. Little children. And then Uncle Martin said to their parents that night, he said, somewhere we read, a little child shall lead them. These young people are about their father's business, and they are carving a tunnel of hope through the great mountain of despair. And my dad went on to say one thing that I love so much, you know, that we're not asking for anything, that this is our home. And he went on to say, until the Englishman goes back to England, the Italian goes back to Italy, the German goes back to Germany, and the white man gives his land up to the Negro. Then black people will go back to Africa. Other than that, this is our home. This is our home. And so, in response to all of what had been happening in Birmingham, A. Philip Randolph organized the March on Washington. And I went. I was there. My parents didn't have a whole lot of money, and so they wanted us to be a part, and they wanted us to see everything. So we're there at the March on Washington. I remember sitting there on the steps and running around, and there was this older man named Benjamin E. Mays. And Benjamin Mays, they called him Benny Mays, was the president of Morehouse College. And he grabbed me and asked me, did I know what was happening that day? And I was like, no, I'm just here, you know, because I just remember the Lincoln Memorial, and I remember the movie stars, because my grandmother watched all those old movies. And then they made us go sit down on the steps, and that's when Uncle Martin got ready to preach that sermon, I Have a Dream. And I say preach because he was a preacher to me. And when he said my 4 little children, because his children were there that day, I jumped up and down and started screaming. I'll never forget it. And Daddy says that night, later on that night, afterwards, they sat, and the two of them just sat there on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial and reflected about what had happened. And Martin said, in that day, black men and white men, Jew and Gentile, Protestant, Catholic, will all join hands together and singing the words of that old Negro spiritual, free at last, thank God Almighty, we are free at last. But young men, he was saying black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, so it's all of us together. It was all of us together. They were integrationists, and that was the difference between Uncle Martin and Daddy and Malcolm X. Because Malcolm X said, by any means necessary, And the only white man that Malcolm X trusted or thought was worth it, when I'd have to disagree, but he did, was John Brown. And just so you all know who John Brown was, the abolitionist who took over the armory in Harper's Ferry, and his descendant is right up the road in Park City, Utah. So you all need to flock to Park City, Utah, and meet his great-grandson, a white man, and he'll to help tell you the history of what they tried to do. And because John Brown did what he did, he inspired Abraham Lincoln. And Harriet Beecher Stowe wrote that book, Uncle Tom's Cabin, and Abraham Lincoln said, "Oh, so you're the young woman who started all this big fuss." Because out of it came a civil war. You know, because everybody knew it was wrong. Anyway, so there's this March on Washington, and that was happening August 28, 1963. So back in Birmingham, Alabama, at 16th Street Baptist Church, where Reverend John Cross was the pastor of this church, they were getting ready to have the first Children's Day ever. And Children's Day is when the children take over the church. So the children do the scripture, the children do the prayer. Do you all know what Children's Day is? Do you all have that here? Oh, it's absolutely wonderful because you engage the children in the process of service. You all know what Children's Day is. In the black community, we have Children's Day. Okay? So, well, anyway, they were going to have the first Children's Day ever at 16th Street Baptist Church. And Addie Mae Collins and Sarah Collins, they're poor girls. Their mother had made them the little white dresses with the red sashes. And so Reverend Cross said that he was upstairs seated in the sanctuary when he heard an explosion. And he told everybody to get down. And then when he thought it was clear, he cleared the upstairs. Well, I'm going to tell you what happened downstairs. Downstairs, there were 5 little girls. There was Denise McNair, who was 11 years old. There was Cynthia Wesley, who had been adopted. Her mom, her original mom, her birth mom, was so poor, she gave her away to Mrs. Wesley, whose husband was the principal. Mrs. Wesley was a teacher. She gave her away so that her daughter would have a better life, she thought. And she gave her to Mrs. Wesley to raise, so there was Cynthia Wesley. And Cynthia was so loving, she always gave back. She always wanted people to know where she had originally come from. Then there was Carol Robinson, a young black girl who came from an affluent black family. She belonged to a club called Jack and Jill of America, which is what I was when I was growing up. And then there was Addie Mae Collins and Sarah Collins. Their parents were so dirt poor, and when you were dirt poor in Birmingham, Alabama, you black and white people lived together because the neighborhood was integrated for the really, really, really poor. Her mom would make aprons and sell them, and that's how they paid for their family. And they had a whole lot of children. And so at the close of Sunday school, all the girls went to the bathroom. And Reverend Cross's daughter said she wasn't going to go to the bathroom because her dad was getting mad. Well, Mrs. DeMann, the Sunday school teacher, went into the bathroom and she said, "Okay, girls, hurry up." So the girls were just putting their makeup on and this, that, and the other, trying to, do what little girls do. They were 13 years old and 11 years old. Mrs. DeMann left the bathroom, and Sarah says, "Oh, I really have to go to the bathroom." So Sarah went into the bathroom, and she was there and behind the stall. And in a click and the flash of an eye, that's when the explosion went off. And it was placed at the window right there by the girls' bathroom. So Reverend Cross says he emptied the sanctuary upstairs. And then he ran downstairs, and all the Sunday school teachers had emptied out the basement. So he thought everything was okay. So he had a microphone, and he was addressing the people when Mr. Lay, who was the civil defense worker, because we didn't have black police officers. What we had were black civil defense workers. The civil defense worker said, "Reverend, there's a gaping hole in the side of the church. Come on around." And he went on around to the gaping hole with a few other men. The hole was so big they could walk on through the hole. And Reverend Cross says they started to pick, there was this huge pile of rubble. And as he started to pick through the pile of rubble, the first thing he saw was a little girl's patent leather shoe. And Reverend Cross says they must have known everything because he said their bodies were piled right up on top of each other, one on top of the other, the 4 little girls. And it was devastating because one of the child's hair, the bombings are just terrible. Their faces were so swollen, they were distorted, that he thought they were grown women, not little girls. One child was so devastated, her neck had been decapitated and the skin was all that was holding her head on. And I was devastated when I heard this. I just couldn't believe it. I was sitting in church that Sunday morning, and Daddy came up to the microphone and he said, "Let us have prayer." And he started to pray, and he started to cry, and that he told us that the bomb had gone off. And I was just fear-stricken because I had just come from the March on Washington, and I was a teeny-weeny little thing. I was 5 years old. And I thought, well, I should have died. They were innocent. I should have died. And anyway, so that day, well, Sarah, let me just go back for just a second. They had gone through all the rebel, and Reverend Cross said he was sure that everything was done, and they had found the 4 bodies, and parents were just everywhere, and just pandemonium. It was so sad. He said they were getting ready to leave, and they heard a, and Reverend Cross said he moved, everybody moved in the direction of the sound, and they moved the door, and underneath it was little Sarah Collins, 11 years old. She was flailing her arms like this. She didn't want anybody to touch her, and she thought, she told me this herself, she said she was saying Addie, but she couldn't make the sound. She was like, trying to say Addie, because she was trying to find her sister. And her sister was her best friend. And she said she could never go back. She went one time to 16th Street Baptist Church after that, but her skin would stand up. You know how you get those chill bumps? It just stood up all over. She was just so devastated. Anyway, because those girls, innocent children, lost their lives, the Civil Rights Bill had to be passed at that point. And America, the social consciousness of America had been raised. And Martin said at that point, "I can't like Bull Connor, but Jesus says love him, and love is greater than like. And when you rise to love on that level, you love those you don't like. You love those who don't move you. You love all men because God says love them." And that kind of love is called agape. And I have a cassette and a record where Uncle Martin preaches this sermon about agape. And you all know that there are 3 different ways about love, right? There's eros, phileo, and agape. And you know what eros is. Eros is when that woman gets you going. That's your love. And the phileo is the love that you have for friends. And agape is God's love manifested within the human soul. And Martin would talk in these very philosophical terms. And then my daddy would break it down so the people would understand and then take to the streets. So, in 1964, young people over America were just devastated by what they saw. Am I taking too long? How long have I been up here? That's okay. Go take your class. Go make an A. Make an A for all of those who couldn't come. So, 1964, young people were just so devastated. College kids all over America went to Ohio. So they're in Ohio trying to learn nonviolence because they were going to take to the South. Young people such as yourselves, majority white college students, went down to the South to register black people to vote because we couldn't vote. They would come up with all the different things. They'd ask you, can you recite the Constitution? Can you do the preamble? That famous song hadn't come out that taught Sandy how to learn the preamble. Because I don't know the preamble, but you had to know all of those things in order to register to vote. If you were black, they'd give you a literacy test, and each state had its own dividing line. So the state south of the Mason-Dixon line had the right to determine. Thank God now, Dara and I had the pleasure of going to Washington when President Bush this past year signed the extension of the Voting Rights Act. And he didn't quite know why he needed to do it, but the congresswomen and congressmen were there to let him know why. Because the FBI, that division, of the Justice Department oversees and makes sure that people have the right to vote and that they are not being denied. So these students go to the South. And Andrew Goodman had been up there in, he's a Jewish young man. He had been up there in Ohio, been trained in nonviolence, and they sent him down there to Meridian, Mississippi, where he was received by Michael Swerner, this other young Jewish man who had a wife named Rita Swerner, and his friend was James Chaney. And James Chaney was a black guy who got involved in the civil rights movement just because he had a crush on a girl named Sue Brown who worked in the office. So in order to be near Sue Brown, yeah, I work in the civil rights movement, yeah, I registered black people to vote. So what happened was they had been working in the community in Neshoba County. Well, the Klan burned down the church in Neshoba County because that's what they were doing. They were bombing churches and burning down the church. So James Chaney, Andrew Goodman, and they said to Andrew Goodman, come with us, Michael Swerner. And the three of them got in a car, and they left Meridian, Mississippi, and went to Neshoba County. They went to the little burned out church, talked to the people, got back in their car, and were leaving, and were pulled over by the police, told that they were speeding. They said, no, we're not speeding. That's okay, you're speeding, and now you're going to be arrested. So they arrested them, and they took them in the jail, and they kept them there in the jail. And Sue Brown called. She knew that they were in the jail, but they didn't release them until nighttime. Then the boys got in their car, and they went on down the road. They were doing their thing, and sure enough, the Klan went and got them. And I don't know exactly how they died, but they ended up missing. So the FBI sent everybody down. And there's a movie that's based on it. I did a movie called Murder in Mississippi with the guy who was Amadeus. I can't even remember. But we did Murder in Mississippi, and there's another one called Mississippi Burning that tells the details of the story, of their story. And, well, everybody was just outraged. These guys had laid down their lives, and so things were just starting to build up. So 1965 comes around, and in 1965, here we are now. And because you all are college students and people want to go into more detail. This is Uncle Martin right here, and he's laid out. Can you see him? He was so cool. He was so cool, he smoked cool cigarettes. And Uncle Retta said he used to smoke Salem. But I don't remember the Salem. I remember the cool. The Salem was before my time. And he used to chew his fingernails. And because he chewed his fingernails, I chewed my fingernails. I wanted to be just like them. And then when they would arrive at the airport, we'd go meet them at the gate. But by the time we got to the main part of the airport, the press would be around. And well, the ladies, they would go to the bathroom, and my sister Yolanda would go to the bathroom with them and get all, dolled up. And the boys would run around with their shirt tails hanging out and be crazy. And I'd be right there with Daddy and Uncle Martin. And that's when I found out they were going to ride on this teeny-weeny little plane. And I said, can I go? Can I go? Can I go? And my dad said, no, Donzaleigh, you can't go because you are a girl. And Uncle Martin said, Ralph, that's the idea. We've got to take the boys. And they took them on that teeny-weeny little plane, those ungrateful little boys who knew nothing. And there I was, a girl so willing. And they just said no. They were constantly telling me what I couldn't do. And that's when I made this vow to myself, what I could do. And that the men would come to us. And sure enough, the phone call that woke me up this morning was my brother, Ralph III, asking me for something. They always come to me, the boys now. But it was only based upon that time, growing up in that time, being told as a female what you can't do. And I'm sorry, there isn't a man on the face of the earth who didn't come here through a woman. Okay? Are we not great women? We are. So, anyway, so 1965 has happened, and everybody is getting involved in the movement. And Medgar Evers has been assassinated down in Mississippi, and Malcolm X has been assassinated by a black man in New York City. And Daddy and Uncle Martin only met him one time, and you'll see that photograph in the book. And up here in the corner here is James Foreman. He's the guy in the overalls. He represents the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee called SNCC. They were the young guys. They were the young integrated movement of young college students. He was their leader. And right up in here in the corner is a guy named James Farmer, who was head of the Congress of Racial Equality, CORE. And all of his people left New York and got on those buses when they did that interstate communication to try and integrate Greyhound and Trailways buses in the South, because it was legal. And you'll be able to see that happen in '61, how they brutalized those people. Even John Siegenthaler, who worked for the Attorney General at the time, who was Robert Kennedy. They beat John Siegenthaler, a white man, just for being with black people. Anyway, so they decided they're going to have this march in response to the death of Jimmy Lee Jackson, this young man who was protecting his family. Let's go to the next one and you'll be able to see. Oh, before we go there, there's this photograph of Daddy and Uncle Martin, and they're totally lost. And that's why I love this photograph, because men, they didn't always know what was going on. But my dad used to say the most important thing is to ask the question. And if you don't know something, there are enough know-it-alls in the world who will tell you what it is that you need to know. But you got to admit first and foremost that you don't know. And so that's why I love this, because that's the way I knew them. And they worried so much. Let's go to the next one. So this is 1963, and this is Jim Lethera. He's a white man who walked the 55 miles from Selma to Montgomery. And this was all about the right to vote, something that people seem to take for granted today. And I want you to know, none of us, that's the one thing that we have as American citizens, is the right to exercise that vote. And when time comes for election, we need to be like people are in all these other countries. They flock to the polls in the greatest amount of numbers and set record things. And that's what we as Americans need to do. That's what makes our country so great. That's what democracy is. When we as the people have the right to say what will govern us when we go to the ballot box. That's when we have the power. And that's all we wanted at that point. One man, one vote. Because before that, Congress had appropriated black people as 3/5 of a human being when they were doing the appropriations, when deciding, you know, this is before the Civil War, when they were trying to decide, you know, how many congressional seats, the Electoral College, all of that was based, and they only counted 3/5, so we were 3/5 of a human being. Anyway, you know this. You'll teach the rest, you'll teach them. The professor here, Professor Francis, flock to his class and he will teach you all of these things that you need to know. So Jim Lethera is walking that 55 miles from Selma to Montgomery for us to have the right to vote. And I used to march beside him. Let's go to the next one. And that's me right here, this teeny little girl with my mouth open, looking kind of evil. And this is my brother, Ralph III, and here's my sister. And up above is Uncle Martin and Uncle Retta. You can see them, and my dad's all the way over here in the corner. And we as children, we always walked on the front lines when they had a march. And I just loved it. And on this particular march, what they do is they give you a salt tablet so that you would, could have endurance. And then when we finally get to a destination, then you'd rest. And my parents would ship us off to somebody's house so we'd sleep inside. And Dad and Uncle Martin along the way would sleep outside on the road. And then the movie stars would come. And we'll go to the next one. And Harry Belafonte brought down all these movie stars. And black people would give nickels and dimes and dollars because we didn't have a whole lot of money. And these movie stars gave all this money. This is my mom up here, right here. And that's Uncle Martin. And my dad right here is carrying this thing right here, which is my mother's shoe bag. And you know, back then, that's women wore those high heels with those pointed toes. And that's why women have corns and bunions today, those older women, from all that. But he was carrying me because he was a gentleman. And all I can say to you all, they were gentlemen. They did not do what these young rappers do, calling women those bitches and whores. They were decent men. And they didn't have their pants hanging way down by their knees when you know how you guys have to run like this. I don't know what kind of Pinot wear that is, but pull your pants up because we like to see what you guys have back there. We want you men to be beautiful for us. I'm very serious. Because when they're down like that, that's Pinot. That's what the men did in the prisons. And you all aren't going that way, so just pull them on up and put that tie on and get ready to go be that lawyer, that doctor, and go to work in that office. Become that businessman. Follow Bill Gates. Okay, so let's see the next one. Here we are. So in the evening, they'd have the movie stars. So all these movie stars came, right? Harry Belafonte. And I heard Tony Bennett sing I Left My Heart in San Francisco for the first time on a teeny-weeny little stage. And there is Sammy Davis Jr. He's giving my sister her kiss, and I'm here on my dad's lap waiting for my kiss. And we used to call him Uncle Sammy. And when he kissed us, we vowed we would never wash our faces again. So for 1 week, we did not wash our faces, and my mother was so livid she didn't know what to do. So the following day, let's see the next one. That's the following day. This is that day, the famous day of the Selma to Montgomery March. And that's me right there with the little rain cap. You know, they used to make those little accordion rain caps that would open up the little plastic thing and you snap it under your head. And that's what I have on, because black women, you know, we have to go through a whole lot of drama. Maybe you all don't know, but we go through a whole lot of drama with our hair because we want it to assimilate. So we want to have straight hair, so you go get that straightening comb and you do all that stuff. And if the water hits it, bam, it's kinky and curly all over again and you got a big old afro. So my mother wanted to protect my hair, so that's why we had this thing. And here I am, that's my brother. And I'm having a moment at this particular time because I didn't want to hold my brother's hand. And I was going through this period of anger. I didn't like boys. And I thought, you know, my dad's a minister. We should be in the symbol of a cross. And my sister should be in the middle because she's the tallest. And my brother and I are the same size. But my dad, the chauvinist that he was, said, no, my son is going to be in the middle. And there you can see my mother is giving me the business, if you can see it up close. That's what's happening on that particular photograph. I just wanted you all to know that little story. Okay, let's see the next one. So this is after Uncle Martin joined the march. So the march started that morning from St. Jude's Hospital and Montgomery, and we're going to walk all the way to downtown Montgomery. And there's Martin, and all the way here in the corner with the hat on is this older man, and that's A. Philip Randolph, who was, can you see him up there? Barely. I'm so sorry. He's the man who did the March in Washington, and next to him is Congressman John Lewis from the 5th District in Atlanta, Georgia. Anyway, so we're having this march, and it's a wonderful, prolific march. You can go to the next one. And there was this white woman named Viola Gregg Lausa. And I tell this story about Viola Gregg Lausa because she's barely a sentence in all the history books that they talk about the civil rights movement. She was a white woman from Grand Rapids, Michigan. She was a mother of 5 children. Her husband was a teamster, a trucker, who was he worked under the supervision of Jimmy Hoffa. And she said, I can drive. I just know that what's happening in the South is wrong. She heard about the death of those girls. She heard about the death of the civil rights workers and all those other people. And she said, listen, I'm going to go and do my part. I'll only drive black people back and forth to the polls. So that's exactly what she did. And on the day that we're having this prolific march, this famous march, there's Rosa right there in the corner, my dad, my mother, Ralph Bunche, Martin Luther King, and Aunt Coretta. As we're having this prolific march, and we, you know, Governor Wallace is in the governor's capital, and Daddy said he was peeking through the window, just upset George Wallace, because you have to remember George Wallace is the one who said in his inaugural speech, segregation today, segregation forever. And he was the one who stood at the doors of the University of Alabama and said he was not going to integrate that school. Okay? So he's in the state capitol, mad as hell, because Lyndon Baines Johnson, and this is the thing, if you ever want to get somebody to do something, and this is the truth, you've got to get a Texan. Because those people come from that state, and they have been told that they are so big and so bad, and the only way to take care of a bad boy, a good old Southern boy, is to get an even badder good old Southern boy. And George Wallace thought he was slick. Well, he was not prepared for Lyndon Baines Johnson. He passed more civil rights legislation than anything, than anybody. And he was just, and you can hear, you know, there's a book, I guess, a new book that has come out about him, and people talk about all the things about, he was a tough, tough man, but he did stand for right. And I have to say that I have a wonderful friend named Colin Baines in Los Angeles. Colin just moved away, but when I like to go to the opera, Colin would go with me to the opera. When my book started, Colin went to New York. He left Los Angeles to New York, and his grandmother was Lyndon Baines Johnson's first cousin, but he's a descendant of President Johnson. And when he met me, he just latched onto me, and he was 21 years of age, and I'm over 40. But this wonderful young man would hang out and do everything with me, just elegant, an elegant, wonderful, and he's trying to continue the work of President Johnson. Anyway, so Viola Gregg Lauza is in Selma, Alabama, and she's driving Leroy Moulton, this black man who was in the front seat of her car. Thank you so much for coming, sir. Get a copy of the book. Thank you for coming, ma'am. Have a seat. So what happened was she stops at a traffic light, and there's a truck of good old boys, and they see this white woman with a black man in the front seat of her car, and so they decide to trail her. So they trailed her out of town down Highway 80, that same road that we had marched down. And I see that you all have 80 here. I'm wondering if it's the same 80 that has traveled from there all the way over this way. It is? Yes, it is. It's Highway 80. So we're on Highway 80, well, she's on Highway 80, and they decide they're going to follow her. And this is the truth. The transcripts I got from the court testimony. And the speeds got up to 100 miles an hour on this little single-lane highway, chasing this white woman, blonde woman with blue-green eyes because she had a white, pretty woman, like that woman all the way in the corner who has that headband on, like you, only just blonder hair. And so they decided to lag back, and that's when they said, okay, everybody get your pistols ready. And the informant, the FBI informant who was in the back seat, tried to talk the men out of it. They said, no, guy, you're in the big leagues now. Get with the program. And he, too, loaded his weapon. And they drove up beside Mrs. Viola Lauza, and she turned and looked because she didn't understand what it was about. And they took their guns and they shot her in the face, and her brain splattered all over Leroy Moulton. This is a young woman in her 30s. And the car went over into the side. And Leroy Moulton said he turned the car off with her brains and blood all over her. He said he pretended to be dead when the Klan came back to look. So they opened up the car doors and they looked, and he said he pretended to be dead. And when they were sure that they had a good kill, you know how the deer hunters are, you've made a kill, they got in their cars and they drove on down the road. Leroy Moulton said he stayed there for a long time until he felt it was safe. And when he felt it was safe, he got out of the car and he walked in the shadows all the way back to Selma. And we heard about it that evening. And they said, if they had been smart, they would have known that the car had been turned off. But they were stupid. They didn't know. And so, but the young men, when they went to trial, they were barely prosecuted for killing this white woman. And the head of the Ku Klux Klan became the lawyer. Well, I remember hearing this as a small little child and being absolutely mortified, because on Highway 80 we couldn't go to the bathroom. What we would have to do is go off in the woods with toilet paper and go like this and go to the bathroom. And because we couldn't stop. One time my daddy told us that we asked him to stop. I had no memory of it. He said he was so frightened that he would have to go get his daughters a hamburger. But whatever it is that we wanted, he would give us. And I do remember after Viola Lauza died, I would never sleep in a moving automobile until I was a woman. And after the bomb went off in 16th Street Baptist Church, I would not go to a public bathroom anywhere, and especially in a church, until my sister got married 10 years ago to her husband. Was the first time I went to the public bathroom in my daddy's church. And when I was in kindergarten, I was 5 years old in 1963. And every day I would, we'd lay down at nap time and get ready for recess. And I would urinate on myself every day. And then I'd wait there for all the little children to get up and leave, and go outside to play. And when I was sure that they were gone, I'd get up and I'd go to my teacher and I'd say, I wet myself again. And she said, that's okay, Donzaleigh, because my mother would have already sent me to school with a fresh pair of panties, a washcloth, and some soap for the teacher to wash me up. Because I figured if I went to the bathroom, the bomb would go off. So they killed Viola Lauza. Let's see the next one. And because they killed Viola Lauza, President Johnson was obliged at that point to sign the extension of the Voting Rights Act. That's Dad and Uncle Martin the way I knew them. Let's see the next one. And there they are. And what I love about this, Uncle Martin is smiling and Daddy is smiling, and all the rest of those men are not smiling. President Johnson isn't smiling, but he did want to sign that bill. He really and truly did want to sign that bill. And let's see the next one. Can you see that one? It's a little darker. Can you guys see it? Yeah? Okay. Let's go to the next one. So, it's 1965, and I was given the opportunity to integrate the elementary schools. And I raised my hand and I said I wanted to. When I went to elementary school, to the 3rd grade, I want you to know that the press came, and it was just absolutely devastating. Absolutely. And I'm not going to be able to tell you all those wonderful little stories and things that happened along the way. But it was just riveting to me as a little child. And that was this, the first little white girls wanted to fight me. So then I was so unhappy about going outside to recess. And I used to say, I'm not going to fight you, Susan Weltner. Her father was a congressman, Congressman Weltner. And I said, I'm not going to fight you, Susan. I'm better than that. I'm nonviolent. Well, that just angered those little girls. And so I went to my teacher, and she said, you like art? So it was arranged that the art teacher, at recess, I would go to the art room with the art teacher, and that's where I got to have my creative expression and nurture myself and grow. And I was so happy, and I was so grateful for that opportunity. And there was this one little boy named Wesley who called me a nigger when I first arrived at the school. And by the time we got to the 6th grade, Wesley had older parents, and he was just, he was big, and he was kind of fat, and the other children were picking on him. So he started crying, and he started to go to the window, and he was stepping outside on the window because it was an old school. It was kind of like the school the McGillis School, exactly like the McGillis School. But there was a little part of a ledge, and Wesley was outside on the ledge telling the little children that he was going to jump. And all of the other little boys were just laughing, because that's what boys do. And I just stopped everything, and I went to the window, and I gave my hand, and I said, Wesley, come on inside. Come on inside. And of course, all he wanted was somebody to hold his hand. And when I brought him inside, he was crying. He was like, why you? Why you? I hate you. I said, well, I don't hate you, Wesley. Why you? I said, Wesley, you're my friend. And you're just hurting. But I want you to know I'm here for you. And I could have hated Wesley because he terrorized me in the 3rd grade. But my teacher, Miss Elliott, said, Wesley calls you that because he loves you. And I said, Miss Elliott, I know he doesn't love me, Miss Elliott. I knew that Wesley didn't love me, but I know that he wanted my attention. And so I got the opportunity to show him my love years later, which would humble him. And I wasn't trying to humble him. I was just trying to let him know I don't carry grudges. And when, that's another story. Let me tell you about Uncle Maude, because there's so many stories. There's some, because it's just, I just happened to be in the right place at the right time. God just chose to place me there. Like yesterday when we were in Park City, we just happened to be there at the right time. And ironically, John Brown's great-great-grandson would be there. Anyway, so this is Memphis. So I'm going to jump to 1965 because I got to come to an end because you guys have to go to class and you need to go do your thing. So what happened was black men wanted respect. So they carried these posters that say that I am a man, because that was the most important thing. Because no matter what, a black man was still a boy. He could be 70 years old, but he was still treated as a boy and called boy. And so all they wanted was minimum wage. They wanted to be given respect as as garbage workers. So they were having that strike. So Uncle Martin went to Memphis with Daddy that first time, and violence broke out at that march. And they had to be whisked away to some hotel. And Uncle Martin was in the bed, and again, he was, curled up in a ball, and he was like, oh, Ralph, I should just give up. We should just give up. It's just terrible. And Daddy's like, no. It's going to be okay. So he had a press conference the following day, and then decided to go on back to Atlanta. So they came the second time. They were called again to Memphis. So they were going back that second time. They were sitting in the plane on the tarmac. And every day, at dinner time, somebody would call with some hateful, racist message to my mom. And we wouldn't exactly hear what was said. And my daddy was gone Monday through Friday. We only saw him on the weekend. So it's just Juanita and these 3 children. As we got a little bit older, first there were the white ministers who lived in the house. But anyway, she would slam the phone down, and her whole countenance would change. And we'd eat the rest of the meal in silence, so we knew what was happening. They were constantly getting the threats. So they detained the plane on the tarmac, And the pilot came on and he said, well, you know, we have a celebrity on board, and it's Martin Luther King, and there's been a bomb threat, and that's why we're having to detain. And Uncle Martin's nerves were starting to get to him. And he said, Ralph, why do they have to do it this way? Why do they have to do it this way? Which was taught him. So anyway, they got to Memphis, and Uncle Martin was just a wee bit spooked. And so he didn't want to speak at the Mason Temple that night. And Jesse Jackson said, oh, I'll speak. And Uncle Martin said, no, Jesse, you won't speak. Ralph is going to speak. And so my dad went on ahead to the Mason Temple. And when he walked into the Mason Temple, the crowd went crazy. And so Daddy said, this is not my crowd. This is Martin's crowd. So he said, where's the telephone? And he went and got the phone, and he called Uncle Martin on the phone. He's like, man, this is your crowd. And he's like, promise me you will come on here. And Uncle Martin said, okay. Because once they made a promise to each other, that was it. There was nothing you could do to stop them. So Uncle Martin came on down to the Mason Temple, and they changed the order of the speech, because Uncle Martin would speak first in these philosophical terms, and then Daddy would speak in a plainer, more common language so the people would understand. They would change the order that night, and Daddy spoke about everything that had ever happened between the two of them and the depths of their friendship. And when Uncle Martin went to the mic, the first thing he said, Ralph David Abernathy is the best friend I have in the world. And then he went on to speak. And he didn't have anything written. And at that point, he went on to say that we as a people will make it to the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people shall make it to the promised land. And he had nothing written. He just spoke off the top of his head. And he spoke from his heart. And he was so prolific. And he was so drained. Daddy said afterwards he grabbed him, and Uncle Martin just like went limp in his arms. And he went and sat down. And that evening they had a wonderful evening. The following day they just had they were playing around and had a pillow fight. Because that's what Uncle Martin was. He was very playful. Had a pillow fight, told Jesse what he needed to tell him, told Andy what he needed to tell him. And so they were going to go to dinner that evening to Reverend Billy Kyle's house. So Uncle Martin called Reverend Kyle, wanted to know what they were going to eat for dinner. And then he's like, Ralph, come on, let's get ready. And Reverend Kyle had arrived. And they went out on the balcony. Uncle Martin went out on the balcony because he was trying to make amends with Jesse, because Jesse's feelings were hurt because he didn't get a chance to preach that night. And Daddy was inside. And he said, give me a few minutes, just a few minutes. He wanted to put on his cologne because he was so slow. And he put the cologne in his hand and he rubbed it. And as he got ready to pat his cheek, my dad said he heard something that sounded like a firecracker. And he turned and he looked. And all he could see was Uncle Martin straight laid out his legs because of the door. And he said everybody scattered. He ran to Uncle Martin, and the bullet had gone into the cheek, the right cheek, and his eyes were wobbly. So Daddy said he patted him on the other cheek, and then his eyes focused and he locked in on him. He said, Ralph, Martin, this is Ralph. Martin, this is Ralph. You're going to be okay. You're going to be okay. And Andy Young started crying. He said, it's all over. It's all over. And my dad never yelled, except in the pulpit when he was preaching. He was a very soft-spoken, gentle man. He said he yelled at Andy, don't say that, because he didn't want Uncle Martin to hear it, because he didn't want Uncle Martin to give up. Anyway, so they got in the ambulance and they went on to the hospital. And at the hospital, they took the scissors and they cut straight down on his clothes. And there was a big gaping hole in Uncle Martin's chest. My dad said my dad had big hands, and he said the hole was so big he could have put his fist in that hole. And the bullet had gone from the cheek to the spine. And they said that it had severed his spinal cord, and if he lived, he would be a vegetable, and that it would be an act of mercy if they took him. And my dad said, no, please, just work on him. You got to do what you want to do. Please make him better. So my dad said, they came over to him again, and they said, Dr. Abernathy, he's not going to make it. If you want to have these final moments with him, you can. And so Daddy went over to him, and he took him up and he cradled him in his arms, and then his breathing got shorter and shorter and shorter, and then it was gone. And Daddy used to say, like Lincoln, he now belongs to the ages. And like that, he was gone. And our lives changed. It was just devastating. And the day of his funeral was the day that I I said I hated God. Well, anyway, we found out because we turned on the, we didn't watch television, and this friend of mine, Julie Clement's mother, this white lady in the school, she told my mother to turn on the TV. I ran over, turned the television on, and there I saw that Uncle Martin had been shot and he'd been gunned down. My sister started crying. She got on the phone with Yolanda, because we had a little children's phone in the children's room, and she was on the phone, and Yoki was just freaking out. And Andrew Young said they'll get to the airport. So we got to the airport. We're standing outside on the tarmac. And Mayor Ivan Allen came up and told Aunt Coretta and Mother that Uncle Martin had died. And I didn't know he had died until I saw the two women embrace. And that's when I knew. And then the next time I would see Uncle Martin, Mother got on the plane and went to Memphis. And Aunt Coretta decided to turn around and go home and tell her children. And so the following morning, they went to Memphis. And then that afternoon is when I saw Uncle Martin. And he came down the backside of the Eastern Airlines in a wooden box. And I was devastated at that point. I'd never seen anything like it. I didn't know. My earliest knowledge of death was the bombing of 16th Street Baptist Church. So children were the first people that I'd ever known of dying. And now Uncle Martin was dying, and it was just devastating. And my dad was so heartbroken. But this is a photograph of the funeral. And people came from all over the world just to be there, because Uncle Martin tried to teach us how to love each other, how to live together in peace, how to come together, and how to turn the other cheek, and how when you're put in a violent situation, of course you can fight back, or you can run and be a coward, or you can do something even better, like the girls, when the girls came to me in my boarding school, where Amy Brenner and I were in boarding school at this Quaker prep school, and the black children came to me to fight me, and I said, I can't fight you because you're my hero. And by telling the girl who was trying to fight me that I really admired her, because I genuinely did, I disarmed her. So that's what they had taught in nonviolence, and Martin was trying to teach people how to live, and that's why people came. Let's see the next one. And his body was carried in a wooden a wagon, and Daddy did it that way because he loved him. And I know you guys are tired, and I got to come to an end. And that's me right here, this little girl right there in white, because Aunt Coretta wanted us all to wear white. And we were wearing white in celebration of Uncle Martin's spirit, making that transition to the other side. And let's see the next one. I lost my dad. That's, if you can see, just stuff about my dad's funeral. I lost my dad April 17th, 1990. And the next one that's Bobby Kennedy, who wrote the foreword to my book, who was a friend. Because the Kennedys were always around, and they were just great, loving people. And Bobby came and spent 2 days with me and my family when my dad died. And then afterwards, he invited me up to New York, and we were in Bedford, New York, where Bobby lives. And he showed me a book. And I figured if Bobby can write a book, doggone it, I can write a book too. I'm just as smart as he is. And he was my friend. So it seemed appropriate that he would inspire me, and therefore I wanted him to write the foreword to my book. Let's see the next one. You can't even really see it, but that's Yolanda. And that's Alec Baldwin, who's another celebrity who uses his good, who's very active and politically active. To whom much is given, much is expected. You got to give something back, and that's me in the corner. You'll see the next one. That's Yolanda and me with Gary Busey, who's a reckless movie star, but still a dedicated man. He shows up with all these political things. Let's see the next one. And that's me and Janice Kearney at the White House, because it was like a dream come true. Because they'd go to Washington, and they had an apartment in Washington, but I'd never made it to the White House. But when I was working for the Centers for Disease Control, they had a big event, and it was about AIDS crisis, and they asked me to come be the spokesperson. I don't have AIDS, I don't have HIV, but I just thought that I need to do my part to let people know that about how to protect yourselves. And from that, they were so impressed, they invited me to the White House. And you'll see the next one picture. That's me in President Clinton's office, because the chairs were yellow under the Clinton administration, with Betty Currie, the black woman. And you know President Clinton loves black people. Those two black women were the only way you could get to his office. You had to go through Janice, and then you had to get to Betty Currie. And when he decided that he wanted to leave the White House, he put his office in Harlem around black people, because he was interested in serving the community. Anyway, That's all I have to say. I just know that I'm here doing my part to give back. This book has been a labor of love. All these photographs in this book, I still have a $10,000 bill over there at Associated Press. I do it because I want to make history accessible. I want people to know who they were. They're my words, they're Daddy's words, and they're Uncle Martin's words. It's all firsthand. But I want to give something back. I want people to know. I don't want them to say that this never happened, like people try to say the Holocaust never happened. No, these things happened in American history. Black people endured, and I want to find a way for we to take pride in who we are, not be angry about the road that brought us across, but to be grateful that we are here and to go forward and to make more of it and to make it possible. Because, see, that's my boyfriend right there, Dar Dixon Bajarchi. And his mom is of Mormon ancestry. Yes, and she was raised a Mormon. And she fell in love with a man who came to the University of Utah who was from Tehran, Iran, a Middle Eastern man. And they married. She married the man that she loved. They eloped and ran away because their parents didn't want them to be together. But don't you know they're still married to this day? And don't you know they love each other? And that's the example of what God has. You know, we're all supposed to be together. Even Moses, just check it out. There's something called the Bible, and look at the King James Version of the Bible, and you'll read in that Bible, Numbers, chapter 12, Moses married an Ethiopian woman. And if he could do it, we can all do it, and he was forgiven, and I'm forgiven. And I know that people have been mean, and I've been tear-gassed. I was more than once in my lifetime. Somebody took a hatchet. My dad had a big old scar on his back. Somebody took a hatchet and hit him in his back. And it took him years for him to finally admit and tell us why the hatchet, what the mark was. He didn't want us to know because he didn't want us to be angry. He wanted us to find a way to love. And that's the most important thing, and that's all I'm trying to do, is just to help us find a way to love each other and to get along. And that's why I go on the road and talk about it. And that's how we found Sandy. Was nothing but love. She was a lost woman in New York City. It's the truth. It was 1 o'clock in the morning, and we didn't have anywhere, and we were all stranded. And instead of separating, we found each other. And our lives are being transformed because we reached out, and she was trusting. And I kept trying to let her know, listen, I'm a reputable person. We're reputable people. We'll take care of you. You'll be okay. So anyway, I just want you all to know that everything will be okay, even when it looks like that you can't make it. And there's something called prayer. And I know it works. You get on your knees and you pray and you trust. And that's called faith. Faith can move mountains, you know? Just look at the past, look at the examples. Anything is possible, and that was what I Have a Dream is about. Dream big and then make those dreams a reality. My dad said that he is going to be free one day. And don't you know, he lived to be free. And he's made that holiday happen in honor of Uncle Martin, in honor of his love. So, I just want to say thank you. Thank you to the University of Utah for bringing me here. And I know somebody asked me, why would I be coming here? Why not come here? Seems that Utah needs to hear what I have to say as much as South Central Los Angeles, or as much as Alabama, and as much as Boston, Massachusetts. You all are viable, wonderful people. And when I moved from my little house to his house, thank you to the Mormon ladies who took care of me, the sisters. So thank you all so much. Bless you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Oh, my purse.